Hello everyone, so today we're going to be presenting our final project, which is about a localized minimal spiking neural network for studying the emergence of bottom-up microscopic behavior in embedded agents. Some motivation and related background before we start. So we mainly touch on three fields, which is modern artificial intelligence, modern neuroscience, and chaos dynamics, chaos theory, and nonlinear dynamical system. For modern artificial intelligence, there's been a push recently to look at unsupervised reinforcement learning, intrinsically motivated reinforcement learning. Um, and so this is all about self-motivation and is becoming bigger and bigger in the field of embodied artificial intelligence. Secondly, the expressivity of macro reward is being put into question, and the framework of reinforced learning in general may be limiting us. And finally, we are trying to more and more break down the distinction between training and execution in reinforcement learning. Secondly, in modern neuroscience, we are trying more and more to bridge the gap between neuron level and macroscopic behavior. And one way to do that have been predictive coding in the brain that might be able to explain learning. How that would happen is that you could see neurons as prediction machine, which would give rise to certain properties, such as the spatialization of neuronal systems. And maybe in turn, we could see as well on the macroscopic scale, the brain as a prediction machine itself. And finally, we can see the brain as a nonlinear dynamical system, and we can use the language of chaos theory and nonlinear dynamical systems to talk about the brain and the brain dynamics. And one paper that does this looks at how consciousness is related to measures of chaos in the brain, and they found that being at the edge of chaos is related to being in a conscious state. And finally, spiking neural networks, which is what we're looking at, have been used for a while as in reservoir computing. So it ties into that as well.
So we first implemented a spiking neuron, which takes binary spikes as inputs and aggregate them and fire when its potential reaches a certain threshold. So to do this, we had to first define the necessary parameters and variables, as well as implement the main functions that govern the behavior of the neuron. So for instance, we did the update energy, which updates the energy of the neuron, the function fire, which generates spikes, the function update V, which update the potential of the neuron, and the most important one, the update weights, which govern the learning rules of the neuron. So we first implemented the learning rule derived in the first paper, where we define an energy for each neuron, where a neuron loses energy when it spikes, and again energy when the surrounding is more active. And the second paper, we implemented expanded on the formulation of the Hebbian learning with a term that pushes neuron to implicitly predict the neural activity. They found that adding these terms in the update rule prevented representational collapse by disentangling input classes representation. And finally, the last equation we implemented a neuron explicitly predict activations by having a recurrent weight that cancel out the inputs. In this case, spikes are only emitted when prediction error is high. So we now have a neuron with learning rules. Then we input many neurons to create a framework for a sparse neural networks. To do this, we first embedded neurons in n-dimensional space, initialize connections between neurons based on distance, propagate spikes, and finally vectorize update equations to have a scalable algorithm. Then we had to implement interfaces to pass inputs into our neural networks and to get outputs from our neural network. So we did implement the function writing, which converts scalar inputs to spikes, and the function readout, which converts spikes to outputs. And finally, we did also create a framework for the visualization, the raster plot, which represents the spikings of neurons over the simulation time. And the idea is to get an insight of if our network is in a generative state, that is, all neurons are always spiking or never, or in a non-generative state, symbolic of chaotic system.
Another visualization we did was just looking at the network and its activity here. And then we also implemented other forms of visualizations. For example, this one is a spectral average that the quantity that is used in one of the equations, which helps us get an insight into how the network actually learns. Then we implemented an environment in order to test out our dynamics. And so this environment takes out an action from the readout stage and outputs an observation that would be inputted to the networks via the writing stage. And there's a lot of decisions going on into how you interpret spikes into schemas. Our environment here is pretty simple. It's a 1D environment where you have a sinusoid oscillating back and forth. And here the idea is that if an agent, if a network wanted to reduce its prediction error, we want to head towards the fixed point. Then some quick results and a look at what we've been doing. So here's a raster plot of one of our experiments on the left, and we can see in the red ellipse here that we have an increase in activity, but it's hard to see whether that's degenerative or if that's interesting behavior. And so we created different metrics to be able to test these hypotheses and to understand what's going on. One of them is the entropy plot. So this helps us have an overview of what's happening throughout the simulation time without having to look at complicated networks dynamics, and we can compare between runs. And so here we see a spike in the entropy at that time. We also did a PCA visualization to be able to see in 2D space how the dynamics evolve. So we have a trajectory in 2D space. Here we can see a clear difference between what happens before 300 time steps and what happens after. We can see two different groupings. And so to recap, we created a framework for spiking neural networks to be efficiently simulated by only keeping the most important parts of the dynamics. We implemented 4 learning equations from the literature. We made a toy environment in which we could test out our dynamics. We devised metrics to gain insights into a network's dynamics, and we devised a PCA-based visualization to help see and classify the evolution of a network's dynamics. And then we performed an overview of how the different parameters of our 4 equations interact to create non-degenerate chaotic behavior. And we talk more about that in the report. Finally, for future work and the next steps in the projects, we could evolve networks to find better learning parameters and network connectivity. And this would lead to genetic algorithms to condition this unconstrained dynamics that we have now to achieve a certain goal in the environment. So thank you for listening, and see you next time.